All right. Paul Beston, he is the managing editor of City Journal. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Pop Matters, the American Spectator, just about everywhere. He is at Paul Beston, Beston, and his new book is The Boxing Kings, When American Heavyweights Ruled the Ring. I think it's officially published in a couple of days, but I read an early version of it. It is really well-written book, but it's about more than just boxing. It is really about America and manhood and race and a lot of different other things. Paul, are you there?
I am, Drew. How are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. The book is terrific, Paul. It really is. And
thank you.
I noticed.
Thank you very much.
I noticed it actually had a blurb on it from me, so I thought that was impressive because I'm one of my favorite writers.
Yeah, isn't
that funny? Yeah. So the thing is, the people don't know this anymore, but the heavyweight champion of the world used to be one of the most glamorous titles in sports. I mean, it was something you made movies about. I remember Kirk Douglas was in Champion. On the Waterfront features a guy who had a shot at the heavyweight title. What happened? I mean, this was really a big deal. What happened that made it less important?
Well, my take on it, and one of the reasons why the book is the subtitle mentions American heavyweights, when American heavyweights ruled the ring, is that for most of the history of the heavyweight title, which my book tells from about 1880 to the year 2000, the heavyweight title and Americans were pretty much synonymous. It was on the same track. There were a couple of foreign champions during that period, very few, almost all American. It very quickly became kind of an identifier of almost like an American property. And boxing, as everyone knows, is kind of become a more marginal sport today. I think that the lack of American representation at the heavyweight level is a huge part of that, because that has always been the benchmark that Americans look to when they thought about boxing.
So why did America dominate the sport so much?
I think it has a lot to do with the country itself. I mean, the nature of when the heavyweight title became big came out in the late 19th century, and when the country was industrializing, it was having mass immigration. The first great group of prize fighters were Irish. The Irish were in the huge immigrant group at that time in the United States. First great heavyweight champion was John L. Sullivan. And it started to slowly track the immigrant path. In the 50s, a great champion was Rocky Marciano. The Italians came a little later. He came on that wave. And of course, through most of it, pretty much post 1950 or so, black Americans have dominated the title. They were there all along, but they were being held out for racial reasons. But it has had a lot to do with the immigration and also just the upward mobility that America presents. I mean, it's just different than other countries, and boxing is such a dramatization of that. It's such a dramatization of the struggle to improve yourself. And most fighters, as you know, come from very poor backgrounds.
Yeah, you mentioned the fact that black guys, once they were allowed into the sport, they really did start to dominate it. And Joe Louis is kind of, everybody thinks of Muhammad Ali because they remember him, but Joe Louis is kind of the hero of this book and one of the great heroes, really, of American sport. I mean, can you tell people who just don't remember this time what it was about Joe Louis that changed so much?
Sure. Joe Louis became champion in the late 1930s, and when he became champion, there had only been one other black heavyweight champion, a guy named Jack Johnson. Some people might remember him. Ken Burns made a documentary about him, but he was the most
play, The Great White Hope, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's right, with James Earl Jones as well. Probably the most hated man in America during those years. It was a very different racial climate, and Johnson was a very defiant man. He rankled white norms very bravely, but perhaps not very advisedly. Yeah. So it was a long time between before whites were even willing to give a black fighter a chance again at this title that meant so much to people. Joe Louis came along. They gave him that chance. He became champion, and he was champion for well over a decade. He went through the war years. His most high-profile fight was against a German named Max Schmeling, who'd been adopted by the Nazi regime in Germany, and the master race and all that business. He managed to rally Americans, black and white, to his side, and by the time he retired, there were whites in the crowds rooting for him against white opponents, which would have been unheard of before. And I think that he is overlooked today because people think of Jackie Robinson and integrating baseball, and Jackie Robinson deserves all the credit he gets. But Joe Louis was alone. He was just working alone out there with this great title 10 years before Jackie Robinson took the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers.
And the fact that he went up against Schmeling, I mean, the representative of the so-called master race, and united Americans behind him. I mean, it's a very moving story. I mean, is that the fight where Lewis said, "In the ring you can run, but you can't hide"? Is that where that quote comes from?
He said that about a different opponent, but
okay.
it's fine. It can be pasted in anywhere you need it.
so then Ali comes along, and Ali, when they were recently, doing his obit and paying tribute to him, everybody mentions the fact that he lost several good years to the Vietnam War and to his anti-war stance. But you take a very different interpretation of that. I mean, you look at this and you really see a very sinister presence behind the Ali championship.
Yeah, and I'm not alone in this. I mean, one of the things about the Ali literature, and it is a literature at this point, I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of books, is that you start poking around in this, there are pages that start to flash red. And what most of them have to do with is the level of intimidation and control that the Nation of Islam, which he joined, and when he changed his name from Cassius Clay, which they had over him. Most people know their association with the assassination of Malcolm X. A lot of people don't know that Ali was very close to Malcolm X, and he was ordered to break off the friendship by Elijah Muhammad, and not long after that, Malcolm X, wasn't in this world. There were people who knew Ali very well, who heard him express his fears. In the Wall Street Journal piece I wrote, I quoted a guy named Dave Kindred, who covered Ali for decades in Louisville, said that Ali told him point blank in the 70s, "I would have gotten out of this years ago, but I'm not going to become another Malcolm X. If I try to leave the Muslims, they would shoot me too." And that's the quote.
Wow.
So it sheds light on what happened when he made this decision not to go into the draft. And I just, my interpretation of that and others is that this was not his decision to make. And I think what people confuse about it is that subsequently he became a great anti-war spokesman. He's one of the most charismatic people that probably ever lived, right? So he did a great job at it. But I think people confuse that with the idea that this was actually his choice. I argue that it is not.
Wow.
It was not.
That is a cool story. There's something recently they had that kind of gimmicky match between Mayweather and I forget the other guy's name. McGregor. Mayweather. And so it's a boxer and an MMA fighter. And of course, MMA has kind of replaced mixed martial arts, have kind of replaced boxing in the popular imagination.
Sure.
Is there something, does this say something about the image of manhood in America? I mean, I know this is a big question, but still, there is something about a boxer that is scientific and controlled, and something about an MMA guy that always comes across as a little bit vicious and just wildly painful. Does this say something about American manhood at this moment?
I think the showmanship of MMA and the marketing of MMA taps into the idea that the way to get people's attention these days is with a certain level of sensationalism. And in the old days, even the pace of that sport being fat, having a guy sit on someone's chest and just pounding him, I mean, it's a little different than a boxing match, which can be very scientific and be very gradual the way it unfolds. And I think the older boxers before Ali exhibited a kind of manly stoicism. They were, Ali is the guy who brought in all the flash and dash and the bragging and all that business. That stuff didn't go on before him. And boxers had a kind of dignity to them. Joe Louis exemplified it, but he wasn't the only one. So I see MMA as very symbolic of that. I mean, that's the way they've gotten the younger audience's attention. And I'm not denigrating the fighters, because I think fighters of any sport, I've got nothing bad to say about them.
Right.
But I'm not a big fan of MMA myself.
Yeah. We're talking about Paul Beston's book, The Boxing Kings, When American Heavyweights Ruled the Ring. I've read it. It is really good. It's beautifully written and just very evocative of a time gone by. The one thing that I often do think when I watch boxing now is everything has gotten better. Every baseball player is bigger, stronger. Sometimes it's drugs, but sometimes it's just training. Just the way we've gotten more scientific about training. When you look at the way, like even movie stars, when they take off their shirts now, they look like they've been photoshopped. They don't look like Clark Gable, who looked like an ordinary human being. But the one thing that hasn't changed is the human head. It's just as soft as it ever was. And sometimes now when I see a guy get punched in the ring, I immediately think, call the fight, because the guys are so big and muscular. I guess the question that I want to ask is, can boxing come back? Can it make a comeback? And should it make a comeback? Or is it from a time that should remain in the past?
Well, the second part of that question, I think boxing's history shows that if you try to ban it and make it illegal, it will go underground, and that's the history that it had, of it being fought on barges and out in the country, and it's going to happen. There's something about us as human beings. There's something primal about the contest of two men and seeing who's best, and I think that would happen. So I think it's best to keep it legal, keep it as safe as possible. And I also think, I still think there are merits in the sport about individual distinction and these kind of struggles that these guys have. But obviously the head trauma issue is a very serious one. There isn't much you can do with it in terms of boxing. And of course, football is facing that as well. But I think in America, the only thing that could really bring boxing back in a regular kind of way, the prominence it once had, would be if an American heavyweight came along that captured that kind of attention the way Mike Tyson did, or Ali, or these other guys who I write about. Yeah, I think when you have Russian Ukrainian fighters, and that, nothing against them, but Americans obviously didn't care very much about it. Right.
It makes a lot of sense. Paul Beston, the author of The Boxing Kings: When American Heavyweights Ruled the Ring, a terrific sports book, but also a terrific book about America. Paul, thanks for coming on. I hope to talk to you again.
Thanks so much, Drew.
All right.
Take care.
Talk to you later. Bye.